3, 2, 1. Let's see. Okay. Have a nice panel, guys.
Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone to this very last panel. So I have to say that's a heavy burden that you put on us, Eduardo, to be the very last one to conclude such a great conference. I'm incredibly excited. And I could see, based on the reaction on social media, that I'm not the only one about this conversation. To have a chance to talk with you in public, Bill, is actually always an honor. What the people, I think most people are not aware of, is that we have regular conversations. And often I thought, well, this would be great if, part of it, not everything, but part of it could be public, because I think this could, be helpful information to put out there. So I'm glad that it's finally happening. The good thing with you is that there is no need to introduce you. So we just simply say that you are a professor of computational law at GW and the former chair of the FTC. So what I will try to do is to cover what's happening in the academic space, but also in the space of enforcement. And the good thing is that I can actually do that when it comes to the US and Europe and all over the globe based on your expertise. So this makes it for a very exciting conversation. My idea for the conversation was to structure the discussion around 3 main subjects. Subject number 1, the substance of antitrust and its evolution and where it might go. And of course, prediction is hard, especially when it's about the future. So please do not, put back the video back to us in just a few months to prove us wrong. But so this is subject number 1. Then subject number 2, I do want to discuss something which, of course, also impacts the actual substance of antitrust, which is the subject of populism, or I should probably say the subject of the modern transformation of US antitrust law and policy, something to be discussed. And then I have some more outside the box question, I suppose. And I want to conclude this will be the 3rd time of our conversation. So without further ado, I will dive into the very first part of our conversation regarding the substance of antitrust. And so I want to put, of course, one of the big elephant in the room right here on the table, and I'm not talking about the Google shopping case, but I'm talking about the DMA. It seems that the logic of implementing per se rules is actually taking over Europe with the DMA, and also the US with many acts which are currently undergoing. And so my question to you, Bill, is the following: how good of an idea is that? Personally, I must say that I am concerned about 2 things, both of which, by the way, appears in the DMA rationale. So this is not just, my best interpretation of it, but something that the European Commission is actually telling us is true. First, it says that it has enough experience with most of the practices listed in the DMA. If that is true, it means that those practices are therefore covered by competition law. So the idea that the DMA is just a complement to competition law then is proven wrong. So this is 1. And 2, I'm also concerned that some of those practices are indeed not competition law. And so therefore, if that is true, I doubt that we have enough empirical work to back up the story of, the experience by those agencies. But again, my question is, how good of an idea are those per se rules, generally speaking?
Thibault, I'm thrilled, first of all, to be here with you, and I'm just delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And I give my great thanks to IBCI as well, and the wonderful work they've done over the years in creating a platform for discussion and debate in the subject matter. So I'm enormously grateful to both IBCI and to you, Thibault. In general terms, I'm skeptical about the use of bright line categorical prohibitions in this area. I'm shaped in part by living in an environment in the United States which has tended over time to reserve absolute condemnation for a relatively narrow band of behavior, namely so-called hardcore offenses involving direct competitors. But even there's been the recognition that you'll need a filtering mechanism that identifies when such restrictions are directly related to a pro-competitive purpose and have to be evaluated more completely. or truly can simply be condemned out of hand. And I think that the DMA, for its understandable desire to provide clarity, and that's a natural impulse in our field. In so many areas of the law where we've had the debate between bright line rules and standards. I think what we see generally in the law is that bright line rules tend to be converted into presumptions, sometimes powerful presumptions, but not conclusive presumptions. And the world of standards starts to borrow from concepts in bright line rules to create presumptions. So there's a convergence around rebuttable presumptions. And I think the DMA is painting itself into a bit of a corner in relying on categorical prohibitions. I mean, even if the allowance of rebuttals was made extremely difficult to invoke, I'd still want the flexibility in my system to listen to the good business justification that the firm might bring forward. And I say that realizing that in the course of implementation, those justifications can become so sterile, so overlooked and routinely ignored that you could say, what's the point of having them at all? And I know that happens in a variety of systems over time, but I'd like to have enough faith in the entire process to believe that when good arguments were provided, they would be heard out. Maybe not routinely embraced, but they would be heard out. My experience at the CMA has increased my caution about categorical presumptions. I think that the work that the CMA has done in the course of market studies, in its individual casework, my inference about that work, and I don't speak for the institution, I only speak from my reflection on being a non-executive director on the board, is that presumptions will serve the useful purpose of providing clarity, but will provide a necessary opportunity to allow for justifications. And why do I call it necessary? In a dynamic technical environment, it's hard to foresee all of the circumstances in which specific justifications might be valid. I think all of the institutions involved in this process will acknowledge that the process and the welter of policy development globally is experimental, that it involves testing of different approaches. I'm not fond of carrying out that experiment on the basis of bright line rules. I will mention that I have colleagues in the United Kingdom, policy observers, who are concerned that the DMU approach in the UK is too open-ended, too broad in its orientation, and that its search for the perfectly tailored set of behavioral constraints on each platform will be burdensome to devise and difficult to operate. So that's the warning label that would go on the DMU if you were selling the product over the counter. At the same time, though, my anticipation would be that will gravitate in the direction of presumptions that are rebuttable. So I think if you use bright line rules, there's a great possibility that in a short period of time you're going to have to revisit them and modify them to allow justifications. And I don't doubt the deep reflection that's gone on inside the European Commission in DG Connect and in Comp about what the right approach is. These are enormously capable people working with very hard problems. But I guess if I were writing the referee report for the DMA, I'd say press the authors to explain why the bright lines are clearly justified based on our experience in the past. And if we purport to exclude justifications, aren't they going to creep into the analysis somehow? Don't we end up with opinions at some point that look like carte bancaire and say, well, before you apply the categorical 1011 prohibition, you have to be very careful that it fits within the boundaries of the prohibition. So we could end up having classification debates where jurists and maybe enforcement agencies say, of course, it's a bright line rule, but in this case, you didn't fall within it. So that's a long way of saying I like rebuttable presumptions, even if the presumptions are fairly powerful.
And, certainly companies will argue that their practice is not one of the practices listed in the DMA, but something that you mentioned is the fact that it might be that indeed you want to allow companies to come up with good explanations, rebuttable presumptions, right? What is the story behind the practice, which is one of the drawbacks, I guess, of those approaches. But there is another one, which is that if you put it black and white on a piece of paper, then you have to deal with the trade-offs, right? And there is one that we've been discussing for quite some time now, which is the trade-off that may happen between privacy and competition law. And I think there is another one which is coming our way, which is a trade-off between competition versus security. And that appears very clearly, in my view, with the draft Open Apps Market Act in the United States that will prevent App Store from requiring app developers to use a in-app payment system controlled by the store. And we have something which is similar in the DMA. And so my question to you is, if indeed, and we see that regulators are, in any case, for some of them, taking that path of per se rules and prohibitions. And so how can we approach this subject and this trade-off between competition and security? Is there any rules out there that you could, provide us with, or is it just something for a case-by-case basis?
I think you've pointed to another severe complication with using the categorical prohibition, either in the DMA or in some of the proposals in the United States. I don't know how many webinars all of us have gone to now where some speaker, it might have been me at some time, said, we have to take account of these related policy domains or we're not going to get the right answer. Or we have to take account of how the different forms of guidance that come from each domain might not be coherent. So how do you do that? And competition authorities are being told you must bring all this on board. You have to use what the Biden administration has called a whole of government approach, or what academics, when reaching desperately for a cliche, call holistic policymaking, which I assume means a more complete framework in which you take account of adjacent or overlapping policy domains. If I'm being told to do that, and I candidly recognize that the impulses that come out of each of those systems on a good day might be congruent, on another day might be merely complementary, but on a difficult day conflict. How are we supposed to reconcile these? Except by giving firms an opportunity to say, I have a good reason for what I'm doing here. I'm responding to the policy imperative that comes out of the related domain. Now, it would be a fair answer for a competition agency to say, that's a conversation worth having. We should talk about the justification as you had laid it out. And by the way, we're more impressed if it comes from contemporaneous business records rather than the cleverness of your lawyers and economists after the fact. But we'll also have, as part of that conversation, an exploration of whether or not the approach you've taken is, in the language of the European Commission's jurisprudence, proportional. Did you use the right tool, well calibrated to serve the problem that's identified? But it seems to me that if you jump to categorical prohibitions, you're attempting to forestall a conversation that is going to break out in one form or another at some point. I mean, my suggestion, my prediction would be that if you have the categorical prohibition that takes no account of these policy complementarities or conflicts or uncertainties, you're going to be coming back in a short period of time to put the DMA back on the rack, or the Online Competition Act in the US, you'll be pulling it back in the shop, putting it back up on the rack to repair it and to make modifications, which probably you will have to visit anyway because things are going to change in ways that human beings can't anticipate. But again, it appears to me that one way that you account for this intersection, collision, parallelism of policy commands is that you have rebuttable presumptions that allow, as one line of defense, a firm to say, I'm responding in a good faith manner to the policy guidance that comes from this other policy domain. And if you're not going to address the hierarchy of authority directly in the DMA, you have to entertain that conversation, or I would suggest you'll build up such frustration that you'll be bringing the DMA back in the shop in a short period of time to amend it.
And you know that there is something which also we have to discuss, which is the case in which the trade-off is not even possible. So where, it can't even be considered. So for instance, now we are, we follow the discussion in the European Parliament, and it seems to be clear that they want to conserve the idea that objective justification won't be possible in the case of, your practice falling under one of the practices listed in the DMA. While on the other end, we hear about, the necessity to consider environmental protection when it comes to competition policy. So it seems that it wouldn't be possible for a company to say, yes, my practice is listed in the DMA, but it is good for the environment, therefore give me a free pass. That is, out of the question if you just follow the DMA such as currently drafted, which leads me to discussion another trade-off with you, which is the one that we are going to see between sustainability and low incomes. So it seems to me that if you allow cartels because they benefit the environment, I'm not saying this will be 100% the case, but it might be that the prices will go up and it will hurt low incomes because they won't be able to access the products. And so my question is, again, how to deal with that? Should we prefer one over the other? And also, can we trust antitrust agencies to make such a decision? Or do we prefer something which here I have to say is more in the line of the DMA, which is that objective justification is out of the question. So you don't even have to deal with the trade-off in the first place.
As a starting point, I would say that when competition authorities come to the point at which they're going to make the trade-offs, this framework places an absolute premium on being honest about what they're doing. That is, explaining in a very direct and careful way what they perceive the trade-offs to be and how they reconcile them, and what evidence was relevant in formulating the ultimate solution. If this is a math exam, I think the instructor has to be brutally insistent on saying, I want to see all your work. I don't want you to wave your hands and say that this was an inevitable result. You took everything into account and this is the answer. I want to see how you got from the definition of the problem to the solution you've chosen. And that's going to be awkward. My experience in writing opinions for the Federal Trade Commission when I was in the position of having to participate in the board in an adjudication function is, if you're not entirely certain about what you're doing or how to do it, there's an enormous temptation. There's a little voice that sits on your shoulder that says, the solution here is to obfuscate. That is, hide the trade-offs, hide your uncertainty, construct a straw man for your opponent, and then use your awesome logic just to crush them. And that tugs you in the direction of not being honest about what you're doing. That honesty is indispensable for both evaluating what the methodology is or deciding in the future, do we want to make changes? So these frameworks, let's assume that putting everything into the framework is desirable. And maybe under the terms of the treaty in Europe is mandated. Take everything into account. I want to see how you do it. And I not only want to see the ultimate decision, I think back to my youth in this field in 1979, a few years ago, when I was a junior case handler, working sometimes on mergers. And I didn't have a specific ideological axe to grind. I wanted management to tell me, what do you expect me to do here? In gathering facts, what facts do you want me to gather? And when I've collected them, what methodology do you want me to use? And don't just give me a hierarchy of factors or no hierarchy and say, maximize all these variables. I'm thinking of that young person who's going to have to do that work. So it's incumbent on the agencies, if this is all thrown in their lap, to explain clearly what they're doing and to explain to their own people what they're supposed to be doing. I think that a problem we're going to face is that the more things you bring in, Article 101 is going to start to unravel. It's really going to fray at the edges. There's going to be extraordinary pressure on agencies, maybe when you get to 101.3, to start bringing things in and taking them seriously. And how do you ignore them if you have strong declarations, principled declarations that we're going to save the planet? And we're going to be receptive to a wide variety of experiments that involve collaboration among rivals to achieve those ends. I mean, what person respecting the process of democratically elected officials taking decisions on those issues would say you can't do that? Of course you can. Yet, for the purpose of policy coherence, you want guidance to the implementing institutions about what to do and how to do it, and you want them to exercise their discretion in ways that makes clear what they're doing, and not be so worried about being seen as making analytical jumps of faith or simply failing to provide a convincing basis. Put it down. Yes, then we'll have the debate and the criticism and ask, do we want to keep doing this in this way? But and by the way, this is going to be a universal pressure, I think, Thibault. This is there's a real force. Put it another way. Why did agencies retreat so much to the consumer-oriented welfare framework, which arguably involves price, quality, innovation, monopsony effects in labor markets, constant? And why did they do that? One explanation I've heard many give to me over the course of my practicing lifetime is that's the only manageable way to do this job. And if you open the door more broadly, you end up with results that become impressionistic, unpredictable. And by the way, if everything is relevant, why shouldn't elected officials jump in and saying you're doing it wrong? Why should they not do that and say, that's what we do. We do that all the time. We'll tell you what to do here. I think agencies, in many instances, and I've heard this from none other than the remarkable Mario Monti, who several years ago at a program in the UK was asked, why did you join the consumer welfare parade? Why did you do it? The more economics-oriented approach. He said 2 reasons. One is to make the United States happy and get them off our back after GE Honeywell. That was one. But second was the concern that if you did not build limits around your methodology and approach, you have opened the doors to very broadly based popular sentiments that tell you to maximize everything. And he said, this was one of the only ways we had to cut that off. And those pressures are always present in our decision-making at the commission. So we have a great deal of pressure now to open that door back up. And I don't say for a second that opening the door is illegitimate by any means. But tell me how you're going to do it. So tell me how you're going to apply it.
That's a perfect segue to the second part of our discussion. But first, a few reactions. I think not all of the agencies are actually living in fear of facing such a situation such as the one that you described, which will be Article 101, paragraph 3. I think that some agencies are actually looking for such cases where they can be the first to say, look at what we've done, right? This was a cartel and yet good for the environment, therefore we gave a free pass. I could see how the press will react to that. So I just wanted to mention that. But, once I had a discussion with the economist Philippe Agnon, and he told me that the great economists are the one that will tell you what are the forces and which one is actually taking precedence over the others. And I think this is exactly what you described for enforcement. What are the trade-offs and how do you deal with it on a systematic basis? And if you can't do that, then I see no reason why you will have indeed per se rules. But to be more positive with those, DMA and other acts, it might be that indeed they are forcing us at least to come up with a list of the objectives and the trade-off, if you want to provide something clear to the companies, which is one good thing. Another good thing is that if you do impose such restriction, it might be that it creates a desire for companies to evade those markets and therefore to innovate somewhere else, right, where there is no regulation. So it might be pushing regulation actually away and in a direction which is a bit more disruptive. So potentially not all bad. Maybe you want to react to that?
I think you underscore what's going to be a major obligation for the academy, for professional societies and others, and indeed for competition authorities, is you cannot escape the need to do an ongoing and careful assessment of the actual intended and unintended consequences of these policy changes. If these are experiments, and how many times have you heard leading figures say, it is experimental, but we have to try something. And I think that's a good faith sentiment. And indeed, there is a desire on the part, I think, of some agencies to test out what you might do in 101.3. Accepting all of that, we're going to have to be willing to watch carefully to keep score to see how it's all working out. And to have, because I assume agencies will be honest about that, that is, whomever is raising their hand to get into the 101.3 sustainability analysis, I welcome their participation and I look forward to their careful explanation about what they've done and how they did it. So we can look at that methodology and learn from it, discuss it. That's wonderful. But that kind of assessment will be a necessary part of a virtuous circle of experimentation.
Indeed, and it means a lot of great papers and books coming our way. But now,
Indeed.
and we've been, talking about the agencies, and this will logically lead us to discuss the political implications of antitrust. And that leads me to the second part of our conversation. And here I want to insist for everyone listening to us that you've written a stellar article entitled Root and Branch Reconstruction, in which you explored the modern transformation of US antitrust policy. And what you do in the paper is that you start by drawing a distinction between the traditionalist, expansionist, and transformationist. And so, and you say that those labels better describe and illustrate what those groups actually stand for. And I very much agree with you. But my question is then, can you explain for all of our listeners who and what do they cover?
Yeah, I've chafed like so many of us over time when the debate gravitates to using labels like mere populist or progressive. I guess the only way to begin those conversations is to spend time on definitions. What do we mean by this? I was looking for a way to describe functionally what these groups want to do. And there's one group functionally that says, certainly in the US, but elsewhere, the system works pretty well as it is, leave it alone. I call them traditionalists, but their main belief, and certainly in the US environment, is that the body of doctrine and policy has got things in pretty much a right place. Now, some would prefer to move specific elements of doctrine in one direction or another, but it's open to a fuller debate about what to do. But the conclusion of that group, and I look at my co-author Josh Wright as being representative of that view, is leave it alone. It works pretty well. The second group I call expansionists, and I'd say the spiritual core of the group comes from alumni in the antitrust agencies during the Clinton administration and the Biden and the Obama-Biden administration, where quite a few of the analysts had positions of senior leadership in these institutions. And at least indirectly, I think their view is we should have been tougher. We should have done more. And as a consequence, they've said, let's use existing tools more aggressively. Mm-hmm. And in particular, accept the greater possibility of losing cases, perhaps as a way of going to the legislature and saying, you've got to change the basic framework. Who are some of these? Carl Shapiro, this isn't an exhaustive list, Fiona Scott Morton, John Sallet, Bill Baer, Jonathan Baker. These are all representative of this point of view. Do they have exactly overlapping preferences? No. And indeed, a number of them say we need new legislative tools, especially some form of an ex-ante regulatory framework for big tech. But they are agreed emphatically that the focus of attention should be a more conventional, traditional welfare analysis, focused on the well-being of consumers, price, quality, innovation, the well-being of workers to the extent that labor market distortions induced by monopsony behavior distort the appropriate allocation of resources and affect incentives to provide certain inputs. That's included in the mix. And I think it's their belief that if you do all of those things well, you'll have, as a major byproduct, very good distributional effects. But they reject the broader egalitarian vision of competition law that was cresting in the United States in the 1960s. They said, don't do that. Which brings us to the third group, the transformation advocates, who agree with many of the policy prescriptions of the expansionists, but they beloved the egalitarian vision that the expansionists regard as poison. Cases that expansionists hold out as being excessive in their perspective, cases like the brown shoe merger decision in 1962, the Alcoa exclusionary conduct case of 1945, these are the word of God for the transformationalists. And in particular, the lyrical passages that talk about the protection of small business, of the control by local communities of commerce that takes place there, and the preservation of an atomized business environment that enables democracy to live. Indeed, the current chair of the FTC, Lina Khan, a number of her supporting cohort have said, this is about democracy and about the preservation of sound political institutions, first and foremost. And that if you don't accept that vision, you're missing the whole point. And that separates them dramatically from the expansionists. And there has emerged a real hand-to-hand combat between the expansionists and the transformationalists, a harsh and bitter debate where the transformationalists describe expansion figures as being too timid, as having shown in their period of public service that the only thing they could do was do nothing, and to do it on a grand scale. And the expansionists, I think, who thought they were going to have the big jobs in the Biden administration, they thought they would get the call, find this new group, outflank them dramatically and pass them up, and now refer to them as naive, inexperienced in the ways of the world. That's a direct punch at Lina Khan. And unreasonable in their belief that this broader vision could ever be applied in practice. But to their great dismay, the expansionists found that indeed, Lina Khan's the chair of the Federal Trade Commission, Tim Wu is in the White House advising the president, and Jonathan Cantor, the soon-to-be confirmed nominee for the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, in so many ways has said, I am with that program. The traditionalists and the expansionists never saw this coming.
And so, you know, and I'm not sure as to whether this relates to the expansionists or those advocating for transformation, but we've seen a couple of books this last few years arguing that the last 30 years have been pretty much good for nothing, that everything should be, thrown under the table, that we should even go back to the beautiful days of the 60s and the 70s when everything was perfect. And so I'm not too sure as to whether you will consider that those books have been written for the most part by expansionists or those advocating for transformation. This is part one of my question. And the second one is, if we are to answer that and to show that not everything has been bad in the last 40 to 50 years, which enforcement actions would you put under the spotlight to show that some good things have been accomplished along the way?
Yeah, the approach of the transformation team is exactly as you describe it. They basically say that the world went to hell at the end of 1980 when Ronald Reagan becomes US president and then begins to embed very permissive attitudes into the enforcement program. So they describe that as being a calamitously bad program of failure. Upon cross-examination, they will make minor concessions and say that, okay, the Microsoft case in the late 1990s, that wasn't entirely bad. It wasn't entirely dreadful, but most of it was bad. It's as though the Microsoft case was a rare lucid interval for a psychologically deranged person who maybe 5 or 10 minutes a day sees the world clearly, but then devolves into a state of catatonia, almost by accident that it happened, but the rest of it's awful. The expansionists detest that description because it writes off the Clinton administration and the Obama administration. The transformationists detest Obama more than they detest Reagan and both of the Bush presidencies, because Obama came with such hope, so many declarations about how he was going to renew the system, especially for competition law, had the chance to do it, and in the view of the transformationalists, failed abysmally. He raised hopes to the stratosphere and could not deliver even Silver Spring, Maryland, which is on the boundary of Washington, D.C. He promised the universe and delivered just about nothing, and embraced the world of Wall Street, Silicon Valley, big tech. So he's despised more than the Republicans because we know they're godless anyway, so you never expect anything of them. I would note for everyone, I do have a bit of a dog in this fight because I was at the FTC for most of 2001 through 2011. And I like to think that my time there was not absolutely bad, partly out of fear that the US government could come to me and ask for my salary back for those years. So I'm naturally inclined not to think that 10 years of my life were a complete disaster. But I think a problem with this narrative, and it has precursors. In the history of US antitrust law, people have made the case for basic reform by saying that everything that happened before they got there was a disaster. Robert Bork in 1978 says that all of antitrust from 1940 up through the early 70s is bizarre. He mentions one case that he likes in the area of monopolization, but he says the courts are crazy, Congress is deranged, and the antitrust agencies have one goal, and that's to acquire power and to use it expansively. It's the only thing they care about, but I can save it. Well, the transformationalist is saying the same thing now, that only I can save it. What do you get with this kind of history? Which is that I'm here to save the leper colony, but it is the leper colony. As you say, you overlook good things that took place during the period of disaster. I'll just mention a couple. Coming into 2001, when I became head of legal services at the FTC, the Supreme Court had blown a big hole in the U.S. equivalent to Article 101. That's Section 1 of the Sherman Act, and had raised major doubts about whether you could use a strong presumption for certain types of behavior that resembled a hardcore offense but was not identical to it. And the court raised basic questions about that. Coming in, we said, we have to restore that. And we decided a series of cases that was specifically designed to do that. That effort was pretty successful. Cases known such as polygram. We took a hospital merger program that had failed to block a merger for about a decade. And we said, let's look at the assumptions that are guiding the courts. Let's do some empirical work to contest them. And then let's bring our own cases to try to bring the new evidence, the new learning to bear. This was largely successful. And again, during this program of failure, 3 times over the past 10 years, the Federal Trade Commission has been before the Supreme Court with a competition case. It won all 3. And mind you, this is a Supreme Court that's severely skeptical of antitrust intervention, but the FTC won them all. One of them called Activists, which was not a sweeping victory, but a lot better than what existed before. The other 2 cases were significant victories involving the role of state intervention and ousting antitrust enforcement. We won them all. It didn't happen by accident. These were conscious policy choices. And if I'd seen that happen before, and I'm coming in with my program, I want to study all of those examples to say, how can I do that? How, in the face of a skeptical judiciary, did they manage to do that? I want to study those cases carefully so that I can find the same path to the summit. But if it's all rubbish, nonsense,
no need for that.
No need for that.
And that leads me to the final question I want to ask you regarding the transformation of US policy. Because if indeed not everything was bad, and if there are some good things, and if we do need to conduct retrospective studies and to have, look at what happened and how we've actually came to some great success, then my question is, how do we avoid the pillars that the transformation advocates are putting in place? It seems to me, and you detail that in the paper a bit, you explain that they do rely on certain pillars. And my question is, for the enforcers listening to us and also the young scholars, where should they go to access great resources outside of those pillars to actually learn about what you just described? So which journals should they read? Which conferences should they go to and also avoid? Do you have any sort of tips here in the matter?
I'm going to make a couple of pitches. I think the program that Nicolas Petit is building at EUI, which builds upon longstanding programs, where I think the spirit of the EUI conferences and programs has been an honest debate among people who do not agree with each other. It's an intimate setting. It's a workshop in many instances with 20 or so people around the table. You don't get in the room unless you write a paper in advance and circulate it to everybody. And the ground rule for debate is, to use a phrase I've absorbed from Nicolas, is you get to play the ball, but you don't get to play the player.
Yep.
So if you want to make a hard tackle that's clean, dislodges the ball, we applaud you for your skill and your aggressiveness. If you go for the player's needs to ensure that they will be taken off the field, none of that. And if you do that, you're not going to be in the room. So
American football. Yes.
American football, a brutal, ghastly sport. But if you have, that's Nicolas trying to create a spirit and environment that I think is enormously healthy in our field. That is so we can address, just to use one exemplar, so we can get a common understanding of what actually happened, and then to have a thoughtful discussion about whether we like what happened and what we've learned about it for the future. So if I had to pick one, I like what the EUI has done with their workshops in the past. I applaud the spirit and approach that Nicolas has taken to addressing that. I think we need a lot more of that. And maybe it has to be a quieter, smaller discussion where people are willing to play by these rules. Not the room with 300 people, which is going to be a show trial.
Yep.
You put people on stage, they act, and they quickly feel cornered by what they've said before. They lash out, they fight back, and the discussion degenerates into a Twitter-like name-calling contest where you are a prostitute and I'm a purist, or you're bought by the companies and I'm a clean person. That's so uniquely uninformative. So to give you one example, and by the way, I see this as the spirit of a number of programs that we see around the world that professional societies host. IBCI is one of them. Brazil's had wonderful programs. I'll mention a final Latin American example. It's the Foro Competencia that Julian Peña has organized and carried out in Buenos Aires over the last 20 years. It started as a breakfast meeting, with a few friends who are practitioners, competition officials, and people from the bar and the civil society. Let's sit down on the table, have a meal, and talk about common ideas. That's grown. It's a big table now. It's still breakfast. It's a bigger table. But the whole point of what Julian did is, how do we create a community in which we can get some common understanding of what happened and use that as a baseline for deciding what we ought to do going ahead. Those to me are rays of hope.
Something to do with food, I suppose, because I believe that EY is not stranger to that. But of course, I can only emphasize the EY PhD program, I think, is a place to be for young scholars. So have a look at their website. And
I tell young scholars in that spirit. Whenever you see an especially strong claim in a work of scholarship that is drawing upon a portrayal of the past, go back and look at source materials on your own. Go back and read the cases on your own. Go back and read the secondary sources on your own and see whether or not you come to the same conclusion. I applaud the interest in historical scholarship. It's wonderful. But too often it's become another form of advocacy, of brief writing, where I go back and pick the bits and pieces I like, I cast aside those that I don't, and I say, here's what history tells us. So I'd be, and including where I've said those things. I guess over my lifetime, I've backed off of adverbs like always, never, because of being wrong often enough. But when you see strong claims that say history says X, there are many histories, and you want to form your own opinion.
And so I want to discuss one history, at least, which is the one that you encountered while being at the FTC, and I guess currently at the CMA, although there are some information that you can't probably share, but this is part 3 of our discussion. And I want indeed to discuss the institutional part, which is left apart very often, and I think that's a shame. And so my first question regards how we can actually deal with economic expertise within agencies. And so to be very specific, there is a clear question right now on the table, which is the one of killer acquisitions. And I've looked at empirical work recently published, and I'm just going to give you 2 examples. One entitled The Aggregate Effects of Acquisitions on Innovation and Economic Growth shows that by banning startup acquisitions, you will actually increase economic growth. And they do have empirical data to back up their work. So here you would say killer acquisition is a big problem. Let's ban killer, any sort of acquisition. If I look at another one entitled Effects of Big Tech Acquisitions on Startup Funding and Innovation, what they've done is that they have analyzed over 30,000 venture capital deals in 173 different segments of the industry. And what they come up with is that every time there is acquisitions by Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, and Microsoft, it reveals a positive and causal impacts of big tech venture capital activity. So meaning that the more acquisition, the more there are startups willing to join the market. And so against this background, and with empirical work going a bit all over the place, what should we do, and what should antitrust agencies do? And my question is not, so much as to what should we do with this particular problem of killer acquisition, but how did you manage economic expertise in the past, and what's the right way to approach this kind of expertise in the context of antitrust, and especially antitrust agencies?
An enormous benefit that we had at the Federal Trade Commission, and it's a great strength of the CMA, is that you have a significant indigenous analytical capacity, where you've got lots of first-rate economists who are adept at quantitative methods. They're good at doing superior case studies, and they've read extensively in the field. If you have that team in your agency, you can take the competing positions in the debate and say, what do you think? And you can get a very good further opinion from professionals who are working with you. And in many instances, if these economists are part of a separate operational unit in your agency, they'll act very much, I find, in the best traditions of a good academic faculty. And they'll give you a first-rate referee report on this kind of work. In parallel with that, you run your own research. You do your own work. You invest in your own empirical work. maybe it doesn't retrace the steps of the other researchers completely, but you do your own work. And if that's not in your budget, if you're a small institution, you find partners with whom you can work to do it collectively. And maybe you go to an external academic hub and you enlist their support in doing common research. But if you're running your own research program, that helps you. But another thing you can do is look at your own cases that pose comparable issues. Now, you might not have a completely representative data set. And I'm aware of all of the complications associated from having an unrepresentative data set. But if you have done major merger or abusive dominance inquiries, and you've looked at industry contexts with extreme care, match up what you've seen to what the researchers are saying. And it's especially valuable if they walk over the same ground. They might have. It's quite possible they've looked at your earlier decisions and said, here's where you missed something. A deal that the FTC let go when I was at the FTC and I voted to let it go is Google DoubleClick. Would I go back and take a look at that one again? I certainly would. It could be the first time in my life that I've ever made a mistake. It could be. I'm not going to concede that yet, but it could have happened. But I'd go back and take a look. But I don't want to discuss it in isolation. I want to bring in the people who made the decisions in the agencies. If the companies will send some along, that's fine. Critics, bring them in. Have the detailed reconstruction of the decision to see how it took place. So an agency can have the right people, the right research agenda, their own or with others, and that puts you in a great position to do the assessment. One other idea. You can convene events that bring the competing parties together and say, have it out. We're going to give you a lot of time. It's not going to be a 5-minute summary of your paper. You can do more than that. But after you and your counterparts have laid out their point of view, we're going to have an academic hot tub where the two of you sit here and discuss each other's work. A model for that, in my mind, is a conversation I saw at a dining room table in Chicago. It was at the end of a conference. This was the informal lunch get-together. And at the table were Dennis Carlton and Carl Shapiro. And Dennis and Carl had both given their views about data and data debates about the extent of concentration, trends towards concentration, growth in margins. This was an earlier version of the larger debate about whether we have a big problem. That lunchtime conversation lasted about an hour. I wish I had taken notes. That would have been rude. But these were two people who were willing to play the ball the whole way. And it was Dennis, who's a thoughtful guy. It's Carl, who was a thoughtful guy. And both of them, by the way, dove at points into deep technical details that escape me. I've been a fugitive from mathematics since I was in high school. But I could tell from the other economists at the table that, they were identifying and acknowledging methodological strengths and weaknesses in the 2 points of view. And the result of the conversation was, wouldn't it be interesting to know more about X, Y, and Z? And that's what we ought to be looking at. But what you had was a completely constructive discussion between two of the best we have in our field, who put aside saving face, who said, let's just abandon those kinds of rituals and let's just talk about the ideas right here. I'd like to think that you could reconstruct that lunchroom talk with an audience of two, myself and one other person, on a larger scale. That's a discussion worth having that I think really does lead you to think more. And I think when Dennis and Carl walked away from that, there's a bit of a natural rivalry there. They've been opponents as experts in cases. But if you talk to someone who's acting in good faith and you walk away from that conversation, I think you walk away thinking, God, that was really a good idea. That's a pretty good point. I might have to think about this again and again and again. That's a discussion worth having. And maybe agencies, maybe in affiliation with academic hubs, maybe they can promote that kind of conversation where you bring the people together and say, we want you to have it out here and take your time. You got plenty of time to talk. You guys guide the conversation interactively.
So that is a very concrete advice, and that's actually on the edge of the last two questions that I want to ask you. The first of those two is the following. When discussing, of course, expertise, I think nowadays we do have to discuss computer science expertise. And so my question is, how do you integrate computer science expertise within the agency? Because, to acquire the expertise, of course, is a necessary step. But then the question is, how do you work with those computer scientists? Do they intervene just when deciding the case, or should they intervene, all along? And I'm aware that some small agencies might be listening to us, and I know they have some very concrete concerns about how to acquire the expertise should they succeed in convincing the political power to give them the budget to acquire this expertise. So do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, I think the conceptual argument for the expertise is compelling. The practicalities of doing it, as our colleagues in different agencies would say, is much more difficult. The conceptual argument is, if you want me to look at big information services platforms, where the business models are complex, they change all the time, their ripples through the economy are myriad and extraordinary. If you want me to do that, I've got to understand what I'm looking at. And you can have a lawyer and economist look at that all the live long day, but the lawyer and economist will not understand necessarily what's going on. So it's malpractice to have someone, you broke your foot and you go into the hospital and they say, our best pediatrician is going to fix it for you. You say, pediatrician, orthopedist maybe? No, we don't have any of those, but it's a great pediatrician. Tends to work on much smaller ankles than yours, but they read books on anatomy. They know what's there. I want the orthopedist. So the conceptual case is compelling. For a bigger agency, I would predict that within 5 years, everybody has a significant team. Not a technologist, but a team. Mm-hmm. CMA decided 5 years ago to build this. They've got a team of 40. Not just scientists and engineers. They have economists with high quantitative skills, analytics.
Yep.
And how was it integrated? It could have flopped. It could have been a disaster where people sit in their rooms and nobody visits them. Early on, they explained to others, these are things we can help you do. We can help you frame a study. And all that data you're getting from parties as part of the merger review production, we actually know what's going on in there. Do you want us to show you? Let us look. You want us, you're getting hammered by these expert reports. Would you like us to help you tell what's going on there, whether the assumptions are right? Mm. They had the right person in charge. They had the right team. And in their early efforts, they showed, wow, it looks a lot better that way. Now there's a line outside the building to involve them in cases, the formulation of market studies, and crucially, in the development of the DMU. They have 40 people now. What do I do if I'm a smaller agency? I think of collaboration with other agencies.
Yep.
I think of collaborations with university departments where I might not have somebody full-time, but I can get them part-time to help out. But I want those kinds of resources available. If I had to ask one agency, and they'll help with this, how did you do it? How did you make it stick?
Yeah.
CMA will tell you.
Yeah, very important. And here I do have to mention that we've put together a group of scholars at the Codex Center at Stanford University. So, and agencies, I think, are aware that they can always come to us, and we're more than happy to help. And so that leads me to the very final question. Last summer, Nicolas and I organized the Antitrust Jukebox #1. And so we've invited all of our speakers that day to make 3 concrete reform proposals. So you've made a few, 3, and I'm curious, because of the evolution of antitrust and the pace at which we see that things change so rapidly. If I was to ask you today, and this is my final question, which is the #1 reform that you would implement? Should you be running, let's say, the CMA or the FTC? Which one would it be?
I'd bolster the program of evaluation and analysis of outcomes. And if I really begged you, I'd say I'd like to increase the human capital to do all of this well, but I would dearly love to have a broader program of evaluation and assessment, and to have that joined up with the work of other institutions around the world so that you have the benefit of a broad pool of observations with better data and record keeping that tells me what's going on. How many abusive dominance cases were there in the last year? What kind? Against whom? How are those going? Where can I look to find that out? But a program that at its basis takes your prior assumptions in bringing the case and matches them against what actually happened. And to ask, why did they converge? Pure luck. Why did they diverge? And what does that tell us about the next one? So the greater historical awareness and knowledge that would come from doing ex post assessment as a discipline to tell you what you want to do in the future. Number one.
Beautiful. I think on that positive and very practical note, it is time for us to say goodbye to everyone listening to us. I just want to say a few things. First of all, Bill, thank you so very much for such a stimulating conversation. And also on a more personal level, thank you very much for your support over the years. It means a lot. I wanted to tell you that in public. And also to IBCI. I think this has been a fantastic conference. As I said already 2 days ago, IBCI number 4 was more promising than IBCI number 3. And I think the 5th will be even better than that. So please make sure to come back next year. Bill, thank you so very much. And Eduardo and the rest of the team, see you very soon.
Pleasure is all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
guys. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
It was great fun. Thank you. Thank you.